So I wanted to begin tonight by begin this part of tonight by asking a question that you may think of, especially during Pesach, but maybe not in the middle of January. But seeing as how it is Martin Luther King weekend, and seeing as how Martin Luther King Jr. was a man who understood the answer to this question better than most, I wanted to ask you, why is Exodus so important to us? Why is Exodus so important to us? What is it about the book of Exodus that is so important? Yes?
Is it because God directly intervened to save us?
Oh, it's a very good, right out of the chute. Because God intervenes to save us in the book of Exodus. So we learn about a God who intervenes in rescuing the Jewish people, who were Hebrew slaves then, became Israelites, and are now the Jews. So that's one lesson, one thing that's important about Exodus, is God's role as Redeemer of Israel. What else? The importance of freedom and liberation. Right? We were slaves, and then we were free. So freedom as a word, but a concept and a movement is what comes from the book of Exodus that's so important to us as Jews. What else? Yeah. The beginning of the new beginning. The beginning of the story of the Israelite nation. Genesis is really just about the story of our ancestors. That's our family history book. Exodus is about the story of our people. Not individuals and not their families, but our people as a whole. So the beginning of the story of the Jewish people. Anyone else want to take a shot? Sam. Without Exodus, there would not be us. Without Exodus, the world would not have the Jewish people, and arguably, Christians or Muslims either. Without us, and this is not a superiority thing, this is a chronological fact. Without us, without the story of the Jews, and without Judaism, there is no Christianity, because there is no Jesus, and there is no Islam. Okay, so that's, Sam, that's a pretty good answer. All so far so good. One more?
First time that God used a human being to intervene on his behalf.
First time that God uses a human being, two actually, because of Aaron and Moses, to intervene, to speak for God on God's behalf. Now, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob do that somewhat, but really Moses is going to the Pharaoh and saying, "Let my people go," over and over and over again. Oh, thank you. The Ten Commandments, kind of important. I mean, my point here is that once you got started, once you got warmed up, you see that Exodus is not just pivotal, but it is so central to our lives as Jews. And I loved all of those answers very much because they are right. I mean, they're accurate in every way, shape, or form. One other thing that I would add to the list is the idea of turning slavery into a way of worshiping God, slavery into freedom. For Jews, in the book of Exodus, we introduced this following concept, that with rights and freedom come responsibilities. Avodah, the Hebrew word for slavery, avadim hayinu, remember from Pesach? Avadim hayinu. Our ancestors were slaves. But avodah, we changed the translation. Exodus changes the translation of slavery, avodah, into worship, service to God, avodah. So slavery becomes freedom, becomes responsibility. That is a central message also of Exodus. And how do we know that? Because in this week's Parsha Bo, right there in chapter 10, we get a sense that the Pharaoh's going to maybe change his mind and let them go, which of course he doesn't. But in this parsha, in this chapter 10 part of the parsha, amongst the plagues, we see something transformative in the word avodah. Not in the movement of our ancestors from slavery to freedom, because that happens next week, in next week's parsha B'Shalach, but in a new definition for avodah, as I said, emerging in both meaning and its intention. It says in this parsha, in this chapter, chapter 10, the Pharaoh called to Moses and said, "Go." He actually says, "Go, leave, and worship your God, but your sheep and your cattle must stay." And what is Pharaoh saying here? He's saying, and his intention is to say, once a slave, always a slave. You can go, you and your people, to go worship your God, but everything that you worked on as slaves stays here. Your enslavement here will be meaningless. Moses responds to Pharaoh and says, "No, you will even give sacrifices and burnt offerings yourselves into our hands, and we will offer them to God. We will turn slavery into worship." Rashi, the medieval commentator, agrees with this and says that what Moses is saying to the Pharaoh here is that we don't know how much we will be asked to offer as part of our new service to God. Therefore, you will give us whatever we want, that we can turn our avodah, our slavery, into one of worship. That with rights and freedom come responsibilities. We will use this slavery and turn it upside down, which is a very Jewish thing to do, as a way of serving God. And so in these verses, in this parsha, Moses turns the concept of slavery upside down. From avodah, meaning slavery, the work which is done without free will, without a sense of service or purpose to it, to avodah, service, worship, the same word, the work of our hearts and our minds and our souls and our beings, which is given freely as an open expression of love, in the sense that connection to something bigger than us will only not bring us a sense of freedom, but will enable our liberation. And so in this verse, we learn something significant among all the other answers about Exodus. For the story of Exodus, the book of Exodus creates a way, or I should say institutionalizes later on a way of worshiping God, of turning slaves into people who are now givers. And in this sense, we complete a cycle in many ways of these individuals who are offering sacrifices to God, to the collective. Think about it for a second. The first thing that the slaves learn before they even leave Egypt is what it means to give of themselves to God, to the community, to each other. Think about that, how transformative and powerful that is. We spend many days, much of our time, complaining about the things that we have to do to take care of ourselves and our families, to take care of our community, to take care of the world around us. But we don't have a sense of what it was like to have no rights. We don't know what it means to have no money, where our labor was not rewarded. So our complaints are kind of funny, kind of silly if you think about it in the context of what the Israelites experienced, and not only what they experienced, but how they turned that into an opportunity for service. So I would say from this transformative and seminal moment in the establishment of the Jewish nation, that we should learn, like Rashi suggests, that our greatest service to God can only come through our commitment to do more, to bring more to the table, to engage more, and ultimately to bring liberation, meaning and ultimately hope that through avodah, the service, the worship, the freedom, that these offerings of our hearts and our minds and our resources will ultimately make a difference in the world. And so on this Shabbat, as we stand at the crossroads of many events in our world, chaotic events, and the crossroads of many of the ideas of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that were seminal as well to civil rights, not only to civil rights, but to humanity. let us remember the call that you are not and we are not slaves. We are actually the luckiest Jews to live in the history of history. And let us not forget how lucky we are. And not forget, in fact, to remember day in and day out, that with this great freedom that we have, with this great, call it luck if you will, time that we get to live in as the happiest Jews in the history of the world, that we have an obligation, that we have a responsibility not only to not enable slavery, but to turn our rights and our freedoms into responsibilities of service to our community, to our world, and mostly to God. Shabbat Shalom.